You want to learn some simple stuff that will help you out at first, and then you can get more complex as you go. I'm way more, it's funny to say this, but I've got a much more complex way of approaching things now, and simultaneously I treat it in a much simpler manner now. I'm much bolder about doing less.
You're listening to the Inside the Mix podcast with your host, Marc Matthews.
Hey folks, welcome back. I am very excited. I'm thrilled for today's guest, or rather this episode's guest, the award-winning music and podcast producer, recording engineer, and owner of the Grammy-awarded the Toy Box Studio in East Nashville, Lij Shaw. Lidge, how are you today? Thank you for joining me on the podcast.
My pleasure, Mark. It's great to be here, and it's great to get to meet all your listeners. Who I understand are all music makers and aspiring music makers and songwriters and people who just want to make cool tunes.
They are indeed. And I'm going to hazard a guess and say a large number of them probably do listen to your podcast as well, as I do routinely communicate with the listeners, and they say they listen to XYZ on other podcasts. So no doubt that. But we'll get into your podcast shortly. But yeah, it's always nice to have another podcaster on the show, because as you were mentioning earlier, it can be quite a solo effort being a podcaster. So yeah, it's always nice to have another one on the show, and they're always going to have a good microphone as well, which is which is always good.
And this is my dedicated video mic. It's not actually my podcasting mic, but it's the one that I made sure sounds good on video. So hopefully
fantastic.
It sounds good.
It does indeed. It does indeed.
It's it's funny you mentioned it. So it really is true. Podcasting can be a little bit of a lonely business, in the same way that making music in your home studio can feel that way.
Most definitely.
Find yourself sort of alone doing your stuff, your creation.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I was just saying off air, actually, with your podcast itself. So it's for the audience listening. I'll tell you what it is now. It's Recording Studio Rockstars, and I was listening to it on my run today with your conversation with Brennan, which was really interesting when you were talking about eBay. And, I was saying to my fiance the other day that I cannot remember the last time I bought something on eBay, but I did used to buy loads of gear on. When I say gear, I'm talking about I say gear. I like guitars and whatnot. Over in the UK, gear can often mean something else.
Well, you guys refer to here we talk about gear for the studio. Over there, you guys talk about your kit, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. You're talking about your kit. So, yeah, I remember buying loads of guitars and pedals and whatnot on there. But no, it was a really interesting conversation. So, audience, once you've listened to this one, go and check out that conversation if you want to feel some or listen to some nostalgia when it comes to buying kit or gear, however you want to call it. But Lidge, a bit more on your bio here: a chart-topping producer and engineer, but also the host of the #1 iTunes podcast, Recording Studio Rockstars, where you share insights from over 480 interviews.
Shameless self-plug. Got my own T-shirt on. This is my uniform when I go to events and stuff.
If I'd have known that, I would have worn my Inside the Mix podcast hoodie. But I do have my mug here, so I've got some.
Nice.
There you go. There's my shameless self-promotion.
And can your listeners go get a mug if they want?
I don't think my store's up, and I'm gonna have to double check.
You have to do that.
I was giving them away for free. So I cannot remember if the store's still up and running. It might well be. I never plug it. Maybe I should, but no.
All right, everybody, give Mark a hard time and get him to make those mugs available to you.
Yeah, in fact, I will say that I think that, this is the old logo, so I do need to get some new stuff with the new logo, but the hoodies as well. So yeah, no, I should have worn my my hoodie as well. So what I was saying there was about 480 interviews with top recording engineers, mixers, and songwriters worldwide. You've been in the podcasting game for a while now. I think you were saying 10 years. Is that right?
That's been about a decade now already since I started. And when I started it, I had been really interested in podcasting myself. I'd just been listening to other ones. And then I got this idea. I was like, what do I love more than anything is talking about making records in the studio, recording songs, writing songs, all of it. So why not just make a podcast about that?
Exactly. No better reason. It's got to be something you're cliche passionate about, though, hasn't it? Otherwise, you could soon. I think again we were discussing off air that a lot of podcasts don't get past the 10 or 20 episode mark, and probably for that reason. So, I think it's like 90% of podcasts, which is crazy considering how many.
Well, it's like recording in your home studio. You love it, but as you do it, it's still going to turn into work.
Yeah.
You're going to hit that point where it's a real pain in the butt. And it's like, if you don't love it, you're not going to push through and get to the other side of that, you know?
Yeah, I totally agree. There are elements, as much as I love podcasting, but there are parts of it where it is kind of like that, man, I've got to do that again every week. I won't lie, and it's mainly when it comes to social media marketing. That's where I grimace every time an episode goes live.
And I've never heard a musician talk about the frustrations of having to put themselves out there on social media either, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's that necessary evil. Evil might be the strong word, but yeah, I'm going to roll with it. So, Lidge, spent your career helping musicians and producers, as you've just mentioned then, with recording studio rock stars and obviously with the producing and recording audio engineering as well. So today's topic is inspired by one of the podcast's listeners, and his name is Tony. I won't read out his full name. He'll know who he is.
Tony, and you rock.
He does indeed. He does. Yeah, there we go. A big shout out for you there, Tony. So his pain point is this. When it comes to mixing, is the amount of time it takes to set up a session. And he says rendering MIDI tracks to WAV files, grouping, editing, putting individual tracks in order, not to mention loading up all the necessary plugins. And he says he finds the whole process quite tedious. And if anything, he says it seems to get longer each time, which isn't ideal. So this episode, folks, Lidge is here to share his best tips for improving workflow in music production and mixing.
You know it.
Yeah. So we're going to get loads out of this. So, my first question. So, as Tony mentioned then about setting up a session can sometimes take quite a while, maybe you could talk about some techniques or shortcuts to use to streamline that initial session setup. Audio files, organizing, everything before mixing, basically.
So, Tony, first off, you're 100% correct. It is a total pain in the butt to do all the stuff you described. And it is time consuming. And it also can leave you feeling like by the time you've got through all that stuff, you're depleted. And so you got nothing left more for the creative fun part of it, which is the music making. You know, mixing should feel like a performance. It should feel like you're making music. Like if you're a guitar player, like I am, for example, I think you want mixing to feel like you've picked up a guitar and you're playing a song with your best friends and having a great time. And so, you know, the best strategy for doing that, I find, and have heard from, you know, countless other people, is to simply isolate and set aside the different times. So, for example, I'll just go to the guitar analogy again. You might not want to set up and restring your guitar at the same moment that you want to pick up your guitar and play it, right? So you would want to probably do that at a different time where you get the guitar into perfect playable condition, and then when you sit down to actually play or write a song, you just pick up the guitar and start playing. And so I find for mixing, it's the same thing. It's just another form of an instrument that we need to get ready when we're going to sit down and do the work we want to do. So if you can literally separate your times where you sit down at one point and all you're doing is getting it ready to mix, and then you just put it away with no obligation to do any mixing yet. And then you come back next time knowing that it's ready for you, where you can just sit down and quickly mix. I think you'll find that that makes it a lot more enjoyable. And it could also leave you feeling a lot more, empowered in that when you sit down to mix, maybe you sit down and you mix it in, half an hour the first time because you didn't have to put in all that work. And so you just kind of go through and do a quick balance, and maybe you bounce that mix and print it and put it away again, and maybe come back another time and mix it, and maybe you've listened to that rough mix or that first mix that you printed. Maybe you come back with a couple of notes to yourself and very quickly do another version of the mix and put that away and then come back again. To me, there's a lot of stuff that I can arrive at decision-wise when I'm mixing, but then there's also a lot of stuff that I'm just not going to know until I listen back to it in the car afterwards, especially in home studio situations where I'm trying to stay in the inspiration moment, but the sonics might be limiting. There might be limitations to what I can hear in the bass and the drums and the vocal level and all that kind of stuff. And it can be really, really helpful to hear it outside of that control room context. For example, listening on the phone speaker later in the kitchen while you're making coffee or something like that, or listening in the car driving around. Those could be places where it's really easy to hear something that you missed the first time. And so giving yourself the ability to kind of print a mix quickly with some fundamental decisions, and then have a chance to listen to it and come back and make quicker changes could be an inspiration for you.
Great stuff.
I got lots more to say on it, but I'll let you.
I'll
let you share the mic with me, Mark.
What I was going to say there is what you mentioned about separating sessions, and really does mirror something I was chatting to someone about the other day, which was about the sound design and the songwriting process. And it was I think it was on the podcast, so it might just been a general conversation. And I was asking the question, do you sound design at the same time as you are songwriting? Because for me, I do them separately. That way I've got separate sessions. I know today I've got this idea, this sound I want to recreate, and that is my session, or today or this morning, whatever it may be. And then later I will then move on to the actual songwriting process. But it kind of does echo what you said there about having those separate sessions, in that you have one session which is where you're going to be setting up your project, getting it ready to go, and then coming back to it later with a different mindset, ready to go with the mixing process, which is, you know what, I've always, and I don't know why I haven't done this before, because I do it with sound design and music production, but I always go straight into mixing afterwards without taking a break. And I never thought, actually, it'd probably do me some good to take a break in between. Which makes perfect sense. It really does.
Well, I think it's, there's a certain element of like, you just created this thing, so you want to now keep working on it. That's fine. As long as you're having fun, keep moving forward. But just, we've all got our own personal version of what part of this feels like work and what part of this feels like fun. So I think it's a question of finding ways to separate the two so that you don't feel guilty about stopping in the middle of a process, if you do the work part and you're like, cool, I accomplished that, and set it aside. Because it's really easy to like make something, and then I think all of your listeners can appreciate this. It's very, very easy to make something and then listen and come back later and go, wow, that sucks.
Yep.
So that's normal. Everybody feels that. Like, pick your most favorite famous artist. I promise you that they feel that way too.
Yeah, most definitely. I do it all the time. I do it with actually, to be fair, do I do it with podcasts? I think when I record tutorial episodes for the podcast, sometimes I watch back and I'm thinking, I could have done that better.
I'm gonna remind you of this, Mark. The first podcasts you did, you were grueling over them. You were probably beating yourself up. You probably edited yourself into a black hole.
I've had I was chatting with another podcaster when I was on their podcast a few weeks back, and I was saying that when I first started podcasting, it was just that I was editing crazy amounts, dead air and whatnot, and it was taking me so long, and I was thinking, oh man, if I can't do this every week, this is going to take me a while. But yeah, 100%. And then as time progressed, I became a bit more, well, it didn't take me so long, and I wasn't being so harsh a critic on myself.
Yeah.
But then when I listened to the first episode, it's also the delivery as well. It's a lot different. So audience listening, if you go back and listen to episode 1 of this podcast, you'll find the way that I deliver now is probably a lot different to the way I was delivering it in episode 1 as well, which is interesting.
Yeah, you learn to do things like self-edit when you're speaking.
Yeah.
Because you go through and you edit what was said so many times that you begin to recognize all these details. How many times you say, how many times you repeat a sentence. That was one of the ones that was weird to discover, is like, oh, wow, when I'm talking, I would start a sentence and then start it over again. Weird stuff like that. You just really get to know.
Yeah.
And that's true for music too. That's one of the reasons why it's okay to put in all that time editing at first, because you begin to really discover things. You discover that, oh, when I changed from that chord to that chord, I kind of missed the beginning of the next chord, and I didn't notice it until I edited it carefully.
Yeah, it's what you mentioned there about when you listen back to your voice or what you're saying on that podcast. The one that stuck out for me was that when the interviewee had finished talking, I was not always, but like 70-80% of the time using the same word to then start talking myself. And I was like, okay, I got to self-edit and start using a different word or a different foundation for me to then build on what I want to say. So yeah, it's really, really interesting.
Right. So you can start every sentence with something new, like butterfly or spatula.
Yeah. Little Easter eggs, as we say in each episode, see if the audience can pick them out when I'm using just a random word to start a sentence and see if they can get it. Yeah, I might introduce that in episodes going forward. So audience, listen out for that. I'm going to put Easter eggs in each episode, see if you can pick out what the what that word is for that particular one.
I got more thoughts about speeding up the workflow there. So one of the things, there's this concept of a mix template, and that is a huge time saver, because what you do is you essentially create something that represents a baseline setup for mixing that includes a lot of the stuff that you like. So that's going to vary depending on who you're talking to, what kind of music you're doing, what kind of mix you're setting up for. But for example, let's just take a really basic idea. Let's just say you've got live drums, which tend to be one of the more complex things we can record in a studio. And I understand that probably a lot of your listeners are using, in the box drums, digital drums. Yeah. But still, the digital drums might lay out in your multi-track DAW, like kick, snare, toms, hi-hat, overheads, rooms, and everything like that. So they may end up looking like multi-track mics. And in order to mix that, you may want to do things like collect them all together into a track grouping. You might want to have certain plugins on the kick and the snare that do things that really make them punchy or give you the ability to sculpt the low frequencies carefully. In real drums in the studio, you might have gates that sort of try and get rid of the sound of the bleed from the other things. With your digital ones, they tend to be recorded so well, you're not going to need quite as much of that stuff. You probably won't need any of it, in fact. But you might still want to do some EQ moves. EQ is one of those things that is sort of universally useful across all styles of music, Yeah. And then you might want to take all those drums and have them all busing or routing together through a master output. Sometimes it's called a folder track. Sometimes it's just, an auxiliary bus, whatever it is that you're using to do that. And then on that, routing, that bus routing for the drums, maybe you want to have a compressor and another EQ or something, or a tape thing that makes it sound like old school drums or something like that. So by setting up all of that beforehand as a template where everything is sort of it's an empty track. Maybe there's no actual drums on it, but it's got the right plugins on it. The levels are generally what you would have done when there were actually drums on them, and then it's going to the output fader. That could be your drum mixing template. And you might have a template for mixing that includes all the instruments you might ever typically use. So in my studio, if I have a live band in here, it might include kick tracks, drum, snares, toms, hi-hats, overhead mics, ambient mics for the drums. It might have the stereo room mic that's upstairs, and all of that is routed through a drum output. And then I might have a bass track that has, an input where the bass player is going to record. We do a lot of direct bass now. It sounds, the plugins for bass amps sound so good that you're welcome to go record a real bass amp, but you might actually just be creating more work for yourself than you need to do, since the plugins of amps can sound so good now that you can really dial it in and make it sound right for the mix when you're leaning into the mix. But for example, I might have that track might already have 5 options for bass amp plugins preloaded on it, so that I can just enable one and see if that's the right bass amp for that song when I'm in the mix, when I'm actually mixing. Yeah. And then same thing for guitars. Vocals, vocals typically might want a variety of plugins on them, like compression and EQ, a de-esser. You might want to have something to control the sibilance once you've done all that compression. With vocals, once you add all the compression that you want and the EQ to sort of make the vocals pop, now all of a sudden you've made all the S's sound insanely loud, and so that's why you need to put a de-esser to take that sibilance back under control on your vocal track. And then also you'll do things like exaggerate all the breaths so that it sounds like people are gasping on a microphone when they take a normal breath before a line. And those are the reasons why we have all those special tools like Waves D-breath will help with that a little bit. But honestly, when it comes to breaths, since songs aren't all that long, they're 3 minutes, and there's only so many lines, it's easier for you to just go in and manually adjust those if you want to. I'm probably getting a little overly technical now at this point, right?
One quick question on the breaths there, because I do see conversations online where some might say leave breaths in, attenuating by X amount, get them gone totally. Where do you stand on breaths in a mix?
I do a variety of things. Sometimes I blow it off and just... It's one of the beauties about mixing quickly, especially when you're doing rough mixes, is you can do less of all this trickery and just really try and do a great balance of all the instruments and get the... Look, we all know what our music's supposed to feel like to us, so just go for that first. Just go for the feeling of it, and then print that mix, because then you'll have something to listen to. And then when you're listening to it, you'll get a better sense of like, oh, wow, those breaths sound ridiculous. Or you might not notice them at all. And if you don't notice them at all, then it's not a problem. Don't fix it. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. That's what we say here.
Yeah, it's kind of like don't look for the problems that you're actively looking for those for an issue. You're probably going to find it. But I love what you said there about that printing, that initial just what is essentially just a balance, isn't it? You're just getting a balance, bit of panning and whatnot. And then that's your initial sort of creative vision for it. And then you can use all the other processing that you have available to you to then further refine and enhance it and get you that finished mix ultimately.
And those are tools and techniques that you will learn and acquire and put into your own toolbox as you learn them. You don't have to worry about knowing them all right straight out of the gate. You want to learn some simple stuff that will help you out at first, and then you can get more complex as you go. I'm way more, it's funny to say this, but I've got a much more complex way of approaching things now, and simultaneously I treat it in a much simpler manner now. I'm much bolder about doing less on a mix.
I love that. I'm going to get that as a soundbite for the episode, because I think that's fantastic. I'm much bolder at doing less, because I think that's because you can overkill it. And I used to do a thing about a year ago, which was a thing called the Producers Pub, where probably named it incorrectly. But I get other artists on and we chat about music production. They play some music and we critique it and whatnot. And also another feature we do is the producer kickstarts as well, where the audience come on and chat about a pain point. But a lot of the time, it is just overdoing stuff, just doing too much. And the coaching I do, we were discussing off air coaching, and I often get coachees come in and they'll go through their mixing process, X, Y, Z, and I'll go through just the basics. For example, setting a static balance. And they'll be like, oh, really? I didn't realize that's all I needed to do in that instance. Yeah. I'm like, you're just overcomplicating it. Like, and I don't know if that's it's a sweeping statement, but it might be. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to comment on that. So the static balance is a great way to do it. And then when you're listening back to the static balance and you discover, you know what, the vocal's too loud in the verse, but it's too quiet in the chorus, then, eureka, now you know that it's okay to bring the level down in the verse a little bit on the vocal and bring it up in the chorus. But trying to decide all that stuff before you've arrived at something that you feel confident about is a recipe for just going in circles. I mean, a lot of it is just as simple as that. Your listeners, what might be a funny thing to say is they may feel like beginners about maybe the songwriting or the production or the how to do all the technical stuff in the studio, but just based on the fact that they're listening to this podcast right now is an indicator to me that they are already actually experts at music. And this all goes back to the kind of a famous quote from Ira Glass, who said, you begin as I'm roughing it in, but you essentially begin as an expert in your taste in music. So you've spent years and years possibly listening to music, and so you have a strong feeling about what's good. You know what's good. So your level of expertise is up here as far as what you think about music, but in the creating of it, you feel like your expertise is way down here. And so you're just trying to like work your way up to match your expertise in taste. And that can take a whole, lifetime of practice and body of work and all that. So don't sweat it too much. Just trust your own impression of what you think is good and just keep trying to work your way one step at a time towards that.
Yeah, fantastic advice. Totally agree with all that. Just circling back to what you said there about the templates, so going right back to the beginning here of this particular section. So you mentioned there about having sort of a mix template or recording template. Do you have different templates for different sort of phases of the production process, or like songwriting, mixing?
Yes, although I don't get too caught up in that, because one of the problems with focusing too much on templates is you spend all your time there instead of on making the song. So I very specifically now have arrived at a system that works great for me. In fact, I just literally just last night, the last member of 7 house guests who are here with me over the weekend making music together just split. So I had a house full of people in the studio full of friends and guests, and we recorded 5 songs from demo sketch to something that sounds like it's ready for you probably could just release it as is. I'm of course, knowing me, I'm going to go back in and I'm going to work hard on the mixes and work hard on the mastering and tweak more things and check the vocal notes and all that kind of stuff. But I'll get to all that when I get to it. Right now, I did the rough mixes really where it's like you just go for the feeling, and everybody left feeling really, really excited about it. But that process for me is something that is probably a longer story than we can get into on this whole, just on this podcast. But it involves working with a group of friends where, in this instance, we do something we call poetry scores, where one of the people involved is a writer and a poet, and he really wanted to hear other people singing the stuff, so he sort of shared it with the group of us. Each of us was taking one of the poems and saying, "Oh, I'm going to go make a song out of it," and then it sort of relieves you of the responsibility for the lyrics. You're like, great, I've already got the words. Now I just got to figure out, how do I put this into a fun song? And then that becomes a really great, simple, creative process. You're like, okay, it's like a songwriting exercise. So for that first stage of it, I have been using just my phone to write the song. And I think for different people, they got different techniques. But for me, I am using an app that is actually discontinued at the moment, but maybe it'll come back one day. It's called Spire, and it's from Isotope. They created a little battery-powered, recording device with an app on your phone. And it's pretty brilliant. You could have the lyrics right there in the app, and then you can record multi-track right there, and it makes it really easy for punching in and stuff. And it's very simple. So there's other apps that work great for this too. You could do this on your computer in the studio. I personally find that if I take a guitar and a very simple iPhone recording studio and I go to some inspiring place, then it opens up my mind and my thinking and my creative ideas in a new way, where being in the studio might can feel creative like that, but it could also feel like I'm thinking about other responsibilities, or I'm thinking too much about the finished product, and I just need to think about the song. So in that respect, the initial song sketch is the way I like to refer to it. I would recommend that you find a system that is ultra simple and has don't worry about plugins, don't worry about anything. You might want sound effects, you might want effects because that can inspire the idea. So, a big reverb might make you sing a different way. A cool delay effect might make you play a new guitar part that has a rhythmic element, or distortion might give it an attitude that inspires you. But I'll do that separately. And then when I come in to record the band in the studio, a first part of our template musically is literally charting out the song. I'll arrange it out on paper so that we know exactly how many bars there are. We can still make changes, but at least it gets everybody quickly on the same page, so that we're not I mean, I'm sure everybody's familiar with this, like with the band. No, guys, it's the second verse has that extra, and then the third chorus, and we forgot how the ending goes. And if you can find a simple system where like one page of paper sort of outlines the song, and it's easy for everybody to know what that means, it's going to make that process really a lot quicker. So once we get the band in the studio, then my first template in the actual Pro Tools, which is what I use for a lot of recording, although I use Ableton Live, I use Apple Logic. I'm teaching myself Reaper right now, which is a really great one.
Yeah,
Studio One, a Mixbus 32. These are all great tools for recording. Did I forget anybody? I probably did.
Cubase?
Cubase. Oh my God, Cubase is brilliant.
Yeah.
And if you're curious about Cubase, go check out Mixdown Online with Chris Salim. He's an expert at teaching that, and a great YouTube channel. But so anyway, regardless of which one of these you use, for me, the starting template with the band in the studio is going to be having all the multi-tracks there where all the inputs are going and the instruments are set up. And so back to your setup question.
Yeah.
I set up my studio for this tracking session a week ahead of the session because I had to fly to New York and go to the AES conference all week. And I flew back here on a morning flight. It was basically a red-eye flight. Landed in Nashville, went straight to the studio, and everybody started arriving. And I knew that I would not have any time to set anything up when it was time to record. So again, it's that idea of like separate the setup from the session. If I had tried to do the setting up the mics and the instruments when it was time to record, which I did that when I was starting out, it was a nightmare. Oh my God, I would just be unraveling and just breaking down in stress, and I probably would have had no ability to actually play the music and had no fun.
Yeah.
So I did all that beforehand, and when you set it up beforehand, then you can just be relaxed about it. You can just put on some music and like kind of la-di-da around the studio, slowly setting up the drums and the mics and everything because you're not under too much pressure. So my template for that would be a template where all the mics inputs are line checked for all the band members. I have things in that like maybe the drums are pre-routed to a folder that has the plugins on it that I might use for when I go to the mix. But plugins introduce latency, so I have all the plugins turned off while we're tracking. And I use a system called Pro Tools HDX, which is just a very low latency thing, so you don't hear an echo in the headphones. But whatever you're using, you either have like an app that has a mixer, headphone mix in it or something, but your interface and your DAW, I promise, has some way to hear yourself clearly without any delays or echoes. The place where you might run into latency, delays, and echoes is if you have to use a VST instrument to do your thing, and you've got MIDI and you have to turn up the buffer, then you might have to, deal with setting that right. But for me, I'll have all that stuff. I'll have a master fader that already has, maybe a compressor and an EQ and a tape simulator, and then a limiter on it, and then maybe even and I know this sounds techie. You don't have to use all this stuff.
No, go ahead.
But I'll have a meter plug-in on the end. And so what I do is I actually turn that off at first. So it's disabled so that none of my tracks go through it when we're recording, because I don't need any of that stuff. I just need everybody to hear themselves in the headphones. I'll have a click track in the session template so that I can easily, set the tempo of the song, turn on the click track. Now everybody's hearing it. I get a little more complex here in my studio, which is set up more like a pro studio. So, for example, the drummer will hear the band playing, but they also get a separate feed of the click track that goes to their headphones, which is a lot louder than the rest of us because the drummer is going to need to hear the click really clearly to be able to stay on it. And let me preface this. If they're using a click, you do not have to use a click track. You only want to use a click track if it's the right choice for the song you're doing and for the production.
Definitely. Yeah, lovely stuff, all of that there. When you mentioned click tracks, it reminded me when I was in a band. I was in a metal band, as the audience knows, because I probably bang on
you
about
guys
quite
needed
a lot.
A click track.
We did indeed, yeah. And our drummer was fantastic. He bought us time for my deficiencies in my guitar playing when it came to recording. So he'd bank us time because he was so good at recording drums that I knew I had a bit of extra leeway. I had leeway when it came to my guitar playing when it came to recording, because I was not as tight as he was on drums. But yeah, most definitely in metal, for example. Yeah, it just reminded me when you said that there. But no, all really interesting stuff. I just want to circle back to the grouping side of things. You mentioned there about grouping drums. And I know this is, again, it's a conversation I've had frequently with the audience and listeners and whatnot on social media. But when you are presented with a project, let's say it's just drums, guitar, bass, vocal, maybe some synths, some MIDI synths or whatever it may be, maybe you could talk a bit about your grouping of those instruments and how you would, particularly with drums, do you put all the drums in one group, or do you have sort of sub-buses for or subgroups for each element?
I've tried everything, and I'm constantly evolving. So it's typical for me to take all the drums and bus them together through one sub-bus, and that tends to glue the drums together in a really nice way, you know, and that could just be as simple as a compressor across it, which gives it a little bit of, you know, compression. It might be a tape plug-in or something or a console emulation plug-in that gives it a little bit of a sound. I mean, you know, we all have, again, to that idea of like being an expert at listening. I'm 57, so I certainly grew up listening to records that were recorded on gear that is from, you know, from another time or from another style of studio than just a laptop, you know, and a computer. So there might be a plugin that I want to put on that gives it some of that quality of that sound, because maybe to my ear that sounds like, oh, now the drums sound right, you know. And I think depending on the style of music you make, again, there's going to be a thing that's the kind of stuff you might want to put on the grouping bus that represents what you do. You know, your metal music, there's a whole slew of guitar amps, guitars, styles of drums, styles of drum cymbals, like all that stuff is relevant. And there's probably certain recording studios and recording gear that sounds more like the right answer to you than might work for an Americana folk session in Nashville. So I think it helps to just kind of do a little bit of homework on the style of music you like too, and see what kind of stuff they used, and look for those sorts of plugins if you want, you know. But that's how I would group it. But then at the same time, you might find that grouping all the drums together sort of squishes them together too much, and now you're like, the kick and the snare doesn't have that punch that I want. So you might want to also have the kick and the snare sort of going directly to the stereo bus, you know, outside of the group at the same time. And maybe that gives you a little bit of both worlds, you know. That might sound complicated to explain it, but let's just imagine all the drums go through the stereo grouping bus, but the kick and the snare also has an additional send that goes straight to the mix.
Yeah, I get you.
So there's got a clarity to it. Those are the kinds of things you can experiment with, you know, and sort of see what sounds best to you. And when you get there through trial and error and you start arriving at things that sound better to you, this is how you develop your template. This is how you develop your mix template. And so then when you come back in and do your next project, and this is where it gets a little tricky, you're like, what did I do on the last project that sounded so good? So you want to make sure you keep some of that stuff, you know, somewhere nearby so that you can, like in Pro Tools, I can import all the track settings from one session to another. And so I might import, particularly from song to song in a record. This is where that happens mostly for me. I'll mix the first song and I get something that really is working now. So then I'll go to do the next song and I'll import all the settings of the first song over on top of the tracks on the second song. And that's how I start out with a new mix template for the second song. It was by bringing over all the same mix settings of the first song, for example.
Yeah. I do the same in Logic. You can import tracks, auxiliary sends with the processing and the plugins, and also the automation as well. If you not entirely sure why I would do that, but you can import all that in Logic as well, because Logic is the DAW that I use, and I do use Reaper as well.
Logic's so great.
It is. It's fantastic. Absolutely. So my brother is in music school in Brooklyn, and he sends over, you know,
25 to 30 kids band songs for me to mix, and I've got like 1 day to do it, so I'm like, all right, well, obviously I'm going to have a template that's really fast.
Yep.
So I think I sort of preemptively set up the template a little bit, or he sent over the first song first, and I kind of get a thing going, then I just import it over to the other one, and then Logic had added the auto mastering plugin feature.
Yeah.
And so I would do the mix really quickly, and then I just hit auto master and like listen to them, like, did it screw it up? No, it sounds pretty good. Print that,
It's really good. I've been eulogizing about the Logic Pro 11 in a few episodes, probably about 10 or so episodes ago, with the stem splitter, and I did a few episodes on using the stem splitter and comparing it to other stem splitter applications like Rip Store and G Audio and whatnot. So absolutely loving the only thing I find is, this is going a bit off topic now, with Logic Pro 11 and the stem splitter, you do have to have an M1 processor, so it gets you a bit there, but that's if you need that's if you need to have that. But if you're using the stem splitter,
I use the stem splitter stuff, but I don't know if I use it in places it was originally intended. I'm not like, pulling out tracks and doing remixes of things.
Yeah.
But I use the Isotopes stem splitter that comes in Ozone and RX when I'm mastering a record. Like I'm like, you know what? I think I want a little more vocal, or I want a little more kick or snare. I find it a little bit really helps it come out. And then the other place that was really cool is on guitar sketches, all the way at the beginning of a project.
Okay.
When I was doing, what was it? It was I did, I had one where the guitar player was sending me his sketch, and he strums his guitar and sings. And there's a guitar strum that I recognize all the way from the beginning that just drives me bananas. I call it Jung Jagunga Junga, where people are like, Jung Jagunga Junga, Jung Jagunga Junga. And it can be okay on some songs, but typically it's just a default. So my thinking as a producer on that song was like, all right, it's got that guitar strum, which is really distracting and is going to make everybody in the band think we're doing this boring, light, fluffy song. And then his vocals on top. So with the stem splitter, I just threw it in there, and it was amazing. It just sucked the vocal right out. It removed the guitar, and all I was left with is a vocal track. And I'm like, now I can listen to the song vocal only and imagine something totally different underneath it for, imagine a piano part, or imagine like power guitar or something.
Yeah. I love that use case. That's a great use case for it, because I've been not struggling, but I've been trying to find my own use case for it, having done all these tests. But that I really like when it comes to actually having demos sent across. Any of your listeners, let's say they sketched an idea on a voice memo app on iPhone, and they're like, I completely screwed up the guitar playing, it sucks, or I hit the wrong chord on the piano. Try that. Just throw it into the stem extractor, suck your voice out. Now you got your cool lyric and melody idea. You can even rearrange the melody a little bit, pulling it into Logic or whatever, and you might be able to rescue that good idea. I love that. Great stuff. Great advice, Lidge. Great advice. So we're coming towards the end of our conversation. It's too soon, man. It's too soon. I know. I've only got through about 2 of my questions. I always do that. I go off on tangents. So I'd be doing you a disservice if I didn't give you the opportunity to talk a bit about your podcast and a bit about what you're doing at the moment, and also maybe if you've got something for our listeners that they could consume. So my podcast is called Recording Studio Rockstars, and it's interviews with producers and engineers, bringing you into the studio to learn from recording professionals so that you can make your best record ever and be a rock star of the studio yourself. I just quoted the intro of the show. I know. Very good. That's what happens after 500 episodes, right? So it's really great. It's going to be a total variety of guests on the show. Some are very techie, some are songwriter focused. It's different styles of music, but I promise you will find somebody that really is interesting to you. So go give it a listen. They're long form episodes, 2-hour interviews. So lots of just casual talking about making records, tons of great ideas being shared on the show. And along with that, I created a free course that is just for you. It's called mixmasterbundle.com, and it's an introduction to getting a professional sounding mix in your studio so that you can take your tracks from sounding like basement demos to sounding a lot more like a pro mix. It's a really just simple introduction to it, so you won't have to get too advanced and too technological.
But especially if you're doing band music, it'll give you some great ideas for how to get the stuff to just sort of leap out of your speakers. So again, just go to mixmasterbundle.com and you can check that out. And if you just go to the website, recordingstudiorockstars.com, I think we have 10 different ways to join the email list so that you can know about each weekly episode and just be able to get access to all the information that's there.
Amazing. I will put a link to all of that, so the website and also the freebie as well. And I'll put links to that in the episode description. So audience listening, do go and check that out. And of course, if you're not already a follower, do go follow Lidge's podcast as well, because it's brilliant. As I said right at the beginning, I was listening to it today on my run with Brennan, and start with that episode because I thought that was really good. In particular, there was a conversation that you were having with him about when he was just starting out and waiting tables and his thought process surrounding that, which I thought was really, really insightful and very useful for the audience listening if you're in a similar position whereby you are thinking day job, I want to be in the music industry, how you juggle those two. So
do you have listeners who really want to do this professionally as well?
Yeah, it really does range from those who do it as a sort of hobby and have the day job and then want to just release music of their own accord and just get better at doing it. But then there are others who do want to pursue music, whether that's audio engineering or producing as a full-time occupation. So it really does range between the two.
Well, it's a special time now if you want to do it professionally because there's so much gig. What's the word I'm looking for? There's like a gig economy where you can, go. You can just turn the app on and go deliver food, or turn the app on and do ride shares, and it's much trickier in some ways. When I was starting, where you're like, I don't even know what job I could do because if somebody calls me for a studio session, the answer is always yes. So delivering pizzas was my first one, and until I did a U-turn in an intersection and totaled my car, and I was like, all right, time to get serious about the music.
Yeah. That's a side, isn't it? That you need to maybe think about doing something slightly different at that point. No, fantastic, Lidge. It's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you today on the podcast, and it's actually the first interview post-summer in 2024. So
right on.
Yeah. It's been a few months now since I've had someone else.
You're like me. I'm starting up the interview season too for my show.
Yeah. I've got a lot lined up now. So audience listening, you'll find there's going to be a lot more interviews leading up until sort of the end of 2024 and into 2025. And some exciting ones ahead. No spoilers. But Lidge, it's been an absolute pleasure, and I will catch up with you soon.
All right, Mark. Thanks so much, and thank you to your listeners for joining us.